Today I'm going to show you how I made this football cake for a birthday. Come join me. I started off with mixing up some batter. I'm going to be making a 3-layer 9-inch cake and then putting a 6-inch football on the top. So after I was done mixing the batter, I put the batter into the 9-inch pans. I then also, the remaining, I used some sprinkles to make some confetti cake for the top 6-inch cake that will ultimately be cut into the shape of a football. After the cakes were finished cooking, I took them out of the oven. I leveled the 9-inch round cakes and then I wrapped them to allow them to cool. I did not level the 6-inch cake. While those were cooling, I started to work on the elements that I would be adding. So I rolled out some fondant. Here I am cutting out numbers that I'm going to use to make the field lines and numbers on the sides of the cake. I also cut out some strips of white fondant that I will use to actually make the lines on the field along the side of the cake. I'll also use some of these strips to put onto the football for the stitching that goes across the top of it and along the sides. In addition to making the numbers and the lines, I also, on the top of the cake, I will be putting happy birthday to the individual. So here I'm cutting out the letters. After I was all finished with this portion, I started to prepare my icing. So I made some brown icing where I used some yellow, red, and blue food dye. And then I also made some green icing that I'll use for the field. And then, of course, I used some white icing as well. There's doing some of the green. And then after I finished preparing the colors, I started to prepare the bags. Then I was able to begin stacking my cake. So I put a little bit of buttercream on the cake board to keep my cake from sliding around. I unwrapped my cakes and started stacking. So I put the first cake down and then used some buttercream and spread that out. Put down the second. Notice I'm getting low enough to see to make sure that this is stacked right on top of it. And then I use more buttercream for on top of that cake. Smooth that out. And then added the top layer, again getting low enough to make sure that they're even. Notice that I put the bottom of that cake up so that I have a flat surface. And now I was able to begin to crumb coat this cake. Then I began to smooth the sides out, filling in all the creases and crevices on the sides of this cake. I'm beginning to just fill in some of those gaps that showed up as I'm scraping the sides. Then I put that into the refrigerator to allow it to chill and started to work on my 6-inch cake. So here I'm cutting it, a piece of the center out of the cake, and then I'll slide them together to get that kind of oval football shape. But here I'm having to cut littler pieces out to get the right shape that I'm looking for. It takes a couple tries, but ultimately it will come together. Once I get the shape that I'm looking for, taking a small cake board that I had cut down a little bit, have a little bit of buttercream on the cake board to keep it from sliding around, just kind of making sure that it fits on there. So I have to cut the end off a little bit so that cake board does not show. That's what I'm doing here, is just cutting it down. So now I'm putting some buttercream in between the two halves of that cake so that it'll hold them together nice and snug. And then I can begin to crumb coat this cake too. Just pushing that together here nice and firm. And now I'm crumb coating that cake. Just working to smooth that down as best I can. In between each time I will put that into, allow it to chill a bit, and then just to smooth it out nice and smooth like a football. Here I am, I'm cutting some of those white strips that I had done previously, and I'm cutting them in half to make them a bit thinner. I'm going to use those at the end to put the stitching on that typically is on a football. Using a brush with some piping gel, putting that onto the back of the strip, and then I'll put that onto the ends of this football. Now you'll notice it doesn't go the whole way down, and that's really because the top half of this represents the football. You'll see what that looks like in a little bit. Now I'm putting that second end onto the end of the football. Now I'm putting that center stitching in along with the crossover stitches. Just smoothing out some of the areas as I notice them on the football. And now I'm going back to my bottom cake, just kind of smoothing out the tops of that so that I have a nice crisp edge, and smoothing up the sides of the cake. And once I have that finished, I'm able to move on to putting the green for the field of the football field. And I begin smoothing out that icing. After I got that finished, I began to add some yard lines on the side of the cake. So I put some directly across from each other and kind of used that as my guide. Ultimately, I ended up putting on 10 yard lines. I'll have a 50-yard line, two 40-yard lines, two 30, two 20, two 10, and a 0-yard line on this cake. And I'm just taking a brush and using a little bit of piping gel on the back of each one of those strips to adhere it to the cake. After I had them all on, I began to put the numbers on. Obviously, you see I just put a 50 on, and straight across from that I put a 0. Put a 0 on all of the lines, and then kind of worked around the cake. Right across from the 50 is the 0, and I put the 40s beside the 50 and so forth down the line on the cake. After that was finished, I used 2 supports to put into the cake to hold up that football. I don't think it would have needed it, but I wanted to put that in just in case. So I put that in, pulled it up just a bit so I knew where to cut it off on my dowels. Then I pushed that down the rest of the way. Then I put in a second one as well, just to hold up that football that's going to go on top. After I knew how far to cut it, I pulled it up, cut that off, and then used one of the other sides to push it back in. Took a little bit of green icing and I put it into those holes, and then we'll smooth that out. Put a little bit of extra buttercream icing on top of there just to help hold the football on top. I spread it out a little bit, and then on top of that I will put that football, which I remember it is sitting on a small cardboard piece that I had cut down so we won't see it. And there we go, we have the football on top. So you'll see there's gaps underneath the side of it, so we're going to use the grass tip, and we're just going to put that around the top to help cover that up and make it look like it's sitting in some grass. These will ultimately match cupcakes that are going alongside of this cake. See the next video, you'll see how I made those. After I finished with that part, I started to add the letters onto the top. This is going to say happy 13th birthday, Cassie. So I started with putting the H in birthday because that really is how we're centering the letters onto the cake. Again, using a little bit of piping gel on each letter to help hold those in place. Used a toothpick here to get a little bit of the excess piping gel out, just to make it look a bit neater. And here's what the final cake looked like when it was finished. Thank you for coming to watch how I made this cake. I appreciate your engagement. I encourage you to like, follow, and share if you feel so inclined. Please come back again to watch other videos. Again, thank you for joining me. Have a good evening.